Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of the Mixtape with Scott. Today's guest is a little bit out of left field from many of the other people that I've interviewed, but I read a book by this person during the COVID lockdown and have been wanting to talk to him ever since. He's not an economist, but he is an author and he's a historian of medicine. And I'm very excited to share with you today our interview. Before we begin, though, we must stop and pause and listen to these beautiful words by Sue Johnson from the book Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love, about the role that stories have and can have, and normatively oftentimes maybe even should have in our lives. We use stories to make sense of our lives. We use stories as models to guide us in the future. We shape stories. Stories shape us. Interesting in what she said, stories as models. All models are wrong, but some are useful, said George Box. And if stories are models, then all stories are wrong, but some are useful. So what makes a story useful? If it helps us navigate our own life, and if it helps us make sense of our own life. That is what this podcast is about. I tell guests before each interview, in fact, that Mixtape with Scott is different from other econ podcasts in the sense that we're not going to be two talking heads talking about monetary policy. Rather, we're going to be one talking head about a guest's life from childhood to now and how they got from being little to being big. I firmly believe what Dr. Johnson said. I believe that stories can help us understand our own life. Sometimes in listening to another person's story, you actually, weirdly enough, as the better that person is at telling their story, somehow, even if it's a historian of medicine and an author from Britain, you will hear your own story and you won't know why it is. That is what happens when you listen to people with compassion, curiosity, without judgment. You feel connected to them. And when it concludes, sometimes you've been shaped by their story and it becomes a model, hopefully a useful model for you to go forward. So with that said, let me give a warm introduction to Mike J. Mike, as I said, is not an economist. He is rather an author of several books on the history of medicine. And he is, like many authors, a person who didn't start out being an author, started out really in music, but sort of through life surprises, sorted himself into this career as a historian of medicine, including psychedelic medicine. So, which, as you may have heard, is rapidly being decriminalized across the country, 15 cities so far, 2 states, and imminent medical reforms coming that will probably reschedule some of these medicines in the next few years. Some of you want to become an author. You don't know how to do it. Maybe hearing Mike's own unique journey will be very eye-opening. But even if it isn't, maybe just listening to and learning about someone new, someone very interesting will be kind of cool. So thanks again for tuning in to the Mixtape with Scott, Season 2. I am your amazing host, Scott Cunningham. Well, it is my pleasure to have today in the podcast with me, Mike J., author and historian. Mike, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here, Scott.
Mike, can you, for the audience, tell us just briefly, how you would go about introducing yourself to someone at a party about what you do for a living?
Okay, I guess it depends partly on the party. My career has been entirely self-employed, so it's been kind of picaresque. It hasn't had grand 5-year plans going forward. I basically am, as I have been for over 20 years, an independent journalist, a freelance writer. I've written mostly books, but I've also done quite a lot of journalism. I've curated exhibitions. I've worked kind of in and out of academia a little bit. So at the moment, I'm an honorary research fellow at University College London.
Oh, okay. Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. Where are you right now?
Right now I'm in Cornwall, in the kind of far southwest of Britain.
Oh, okay. Is that sort of a countryside kind of area?
It is. My base is in London. That's where I work out of. But I'm just down here right now. Glad to be out of the city and its multiple heat waves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds like I'm in Texas, and
Right.
I can
Yeah,
sympathize.
you can relate.
I
Yeah.
can relate. Well, so before we get into your career, can you tell me about your childhood? If we were to go back to maybe when you were like 10 years old, can you tell me about some of the things that, you know, an observer would sort of say, you know, Mike is this kind of kid or does these kinds of things, and also what you would say about yourself if it's different?
Yeah, okay. I grew up in the western suburbs of London. If you ever fly into Heathrow Airport, you'll notice kind of as you go into your final descent, you're flying over rows and rows of kind of terraced houses that were built in the 1910s and the 1920s. So it's kind of what was called Metro land. It was built when the subway extension ran out there. So I guess that was my world for the first 10 years of my life. And I was, I don't have a lot of deep reflections about myself as a kid. I mean, I guess I could say I read a lot of books, which I did. And I was kind of not super great at school, but I was quite into my schoolwork. But I was also pretty deeply into nature. Our house backed onto a little bit of wetlands around the canal there. And I used to do lots of kind of tramping around, looking for bugs and insects and collecting leeches out of the canal and that kind of thing.
Oh,
So
wow.
I felt like a very normal kid, but maybe somebody who's looking at me from the outside would find it all very strange.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were a big reader. What kind of books were you reading as a kid? Sort of like,
I was mostly reading the books that I was given as a kid, and not many of them do I have a lot of connection with. I guess the two writers who I probably started to read about the ages of 10 and 11 who had stayed with me were H.G. Wells and Edgar Allan Poe.
oh, okay. Yeah. What were you in? So what were your like intellectual interests as a little kid? If you had to guess, was there something that would be sort of like a natural thing you were drawn to if you weren't given the books?
I guess I was interested in languages and other cultures from quite early on. Languages was kind of what I thought of as my good subjects at school. I found them easy. But of course, this is a time when I had barely at all traveled outside of Britain. I had very little idea what the rest of the world was like. So I guess I had a lot of curiosity about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any siblings?
Yeah, I did. I had younger siblings, two sisters and a brother.
Okay.
And in the way of being an oldest kid, I guess, around about that time, home was becoming a little less interesting for me, and my friends and the stuff that was going on outside was more interesting. So I guess I guess I was on a mission of escaping from the home and discovering the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were kind of later adolescence, did you end up going to college somewhere?
Yeah, I did. I kind of got funneled through the school system from being academic enough, to be told that if I, pursued my work and got good grades, I could go to a good university, and that was very much what my teachers were fixated on. So I applied to and got into Cambridge University.
Okay.
At the age of 18. I was having a little second thoughts at that point. I was not sure that I wanted to do more schooling or being taught. I figured I was more interested in the real world. So what I did, having got into Cambridge, I then got in touch with a whole bunch of advertising agencies and market research companies. Advertising kind of seemed to me to be interesting and creative, as work went. So I thought I'd see what that was like. And
you did that instead of you did that instead of Cambridge?
I did that in the gap beforehand.
The gap year, right?
The way that Cambridge works, you kind of have to do a final term up until Christmas, and then you've got that kind of December till September period.
I see.
So I started, and kind of everybody I wrote to said, yes, come along, give it a try. So I spent 6 months then working in advertising for a lot of, big agencies, kind of Saatchi's, McCann Erickson and people like that.
Yeah.
And the first 6 weeks of that were great. It was super exciting. Everybody I met was very intelligent and smart and creative, and seemed like a lot of fun, and everybody kind of went down the wine bars or pubs afterwards. So hanging out with, being an older kid, I hadn't really had older siblings. That was probably the first time I hung around with people who were older than me. That was kind of interesting.
Right.
But after 6 months, I was starting to feel the limitations of this. When I the people I worked with who I was interested in and respected, usually after 2 or 3 glasses of wine in the evening, they'd go, this job is really shitty. I always wanted to be a novelist. I'm writing my novel, and as soon as I'm successful, I'll get out of here. And that was kind of, so after 6 months, I thought, I'm not actually ready to commit to launching into this for the rest of my working life.
Right.
And I didn't have much of a plan B, apart from, by that time I had a Super 8 camera and I was very interested in movie making. So I went up to Cambridge. I read philosophy, and which was nowhere near as much fun as I thought it was going to be. That was my fault. I'd kind of blithely assumed that I'd be, if I spent 3 years doing philosophy, I'd kind of have deeper understanding of the meaning of life. But in fact, 3 years of studying Wittgenstein does not take you to that place.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And during that time, I was also getting more and more into filmmaking and thinking that was what I wanted to do when I left university. So I had the sense that, I was kind of tired of reading books. The written word felt to me like something that was dying. The language that everything seemed to be happening in, cinema and music, and everything was a visual language.
Yeah.
So I thought when I left Cambridge, I went, okay, I'm never going to read another book. I'm done with that. I've got my camera and I'm going to go and make movies. Right.
Oh, so you went and made movies. So wait, did you graduate from Cambridge or did you leave before?
No, I graduated from Cambridge.
What year was that? What year was that?
What year was that? 1981.
Okay.
And
that was a great period of time in Britain. Music scene was fantastic, incredibly absorbing and immersive and lively. It was kind of post-punk with, the beginnings of what we'd now call kind of industrial music and electronic music coming out of, this really intense social movement. It was also a great time for cinema. Just every week something like Blade Runner or Mad Max 2 would drop. So that seemed to me much more appealing than the academy or the sort of the world of writing at that point. So you're actually graduating with the ambition to be a really a professional creative person making film. So what happens? How do you what's your plan at that time?
I very little in the way of a plan, but I had a couple of friends who had been working that summer in Berlin, working on building the U-Bahn, the subway out there. So I went to stay with them and crashed in their flat for a little bit, and then met a music producer there who had a 24-track studio and had just acquired on the floor below in one of these endless kind of incredibly cheap Berlin warehouses, a video studio, and he was looking for someone to make videos for the records that he was producing. So I kind of convinced him that I was capable of doing that, and that I had to kind of lock the door of the studio and open up all the manuals and try and figure out how all these bits of Sony 3/4-inch tape and mixing desks and things worked. And I had a sort of a year or so in Berlin making music videos for bands, which gave me the beginnings of a show reel. Yeah.
So you were behind the camera?
I was, yeah. And in a fantastically productive, creative scene. Berlin at that point was just amazing. I felt I learned a lot more there than I did at Cambridge.
Wow.
Every night, you'd go out there, there were bars and clubs and cafes, and you know, there would always be like somebody be dropping a you know, old sheet from the ceiling and projecting some experimental film all the time. Everybody was making stuff. It was that DIY ethos, which was very much part of the punk movement, was fully there. So that was incredibly exhilarating, and I learned a lot. And then after a year, I realized that this was an underground scene that was kind of fiercely defensive of itself, and anybody who tried to do anything outside of that scene in the commercial world was kind of ostracized. So after a year, it felt like, well, do I want to be like an underground filmmaker in Berlin for the rest of my life, and how am I going to afford that?
Right.
And the alternative was to head back to London, which I did with the beginnings of the show reel that I had. And I spent then most of my 20s knocking around in London, working in various jobs in film and television, being an editor and being a writer. And that was kind of what brought me back into writing.
Well, so how does that happen? What was so when do you start writing?
I guess.
And
in my late 20s, I guess I was working a lot for documentary production companies, working for BBC and Channel 4, and generating a lot of ideas for documentaries, coming up with some ideas myself, you know, working other people's ideas, writing a little bits of drama, but mostly coming up with ideas and researching them. And I started to turn them into journalism when I could, and also sort of writing screenplays in my spare time and starting to get a few screenwriting assignments. So that was my route into writing.
So you start moving away from like the visual medium, and you start moving you're still in this like motion picture kind of industry type, but you're moving away from filming into writing screenplays.
Yeah, that's right. I think what I discovered by that point was that I was not bad at some aspects of writing. I was good at, and editing was the other thing where I was pretty good. The bit in the middle, the shooting, which is really the core of filmmaking. I don't think, I didn't have a real flair for that. I was kind of, I always found when I was doing that, it was rushed. You were just trying to get the best. If you get 80% of your shooting script, you were doing okay. You know, I didn't really have that kind of that sort of visionary ability and the ability to kind of enthuse dozens of people working with me. I was kind of better when I found myself either at a desk or at a computer or at an editing console when I was pulling stuff together and making sense of it. Yeah. And I also discovered then that in terms of screenplay writing and fiction, I discovered surely was not really my forte, that I was, I never quite believed the characters that I was inventing, and I never quite believed the dialogue that I was giving them. So then what was great for me with books was the possibility of writing narrative non-fiction, where you could use a lot of this fictional toolkit. And you were working with characters, real characters, but they were not characters that had come out of my head. They were characters that I'd generated or sort of found in the sources and elaborated. And then I found myself in a world writing popular history, where most people writing popular history had come out of a more academic background, and that I guess their model for the book was something like a lecture series, 8 chapters. And my model for a book was still more, and I think still is, more like a movie, something that grabs people with a kind of opening scene with sort of drama and tension and conflict, and then kind of unpacks it and has and I used quite a lot of things that most historians don't use, like flashbacks and switches of perspective, that kind of screenwriting toolkit. So in that sense, I think my writing career has been quite marked by my early apprenticeship in film and TV.
That is fascinating. Was it so the transition to the first book, are you moving through writing journalistic essays first, and then like the book part is a natural progression, or is it more of a discrete jump right into the book writing?
I had always had books on the back burner, books that I was writing, unpublished novels. I was kind of thinking back at it. I was kind of working double time because I was doing office jobs pretty much all the time, paying the rent. And then when I came home in the evening, I was writing, sort of 4 or 5 evenings a week. And that went on for a long time. I doubt I'd have the stamina to do that now.
Yeah.
But the thing that kicked in that sort of got me onto the book writing was a fortuitous connection with a medical historian who was a senior lecturer at the Wellcome Trust in London, which had an academic unit there.
What year would this have been? What year? You were in your 30s?
Yeah, this is kind of 90s, mid 90s, I guess. Unit led by Roy Porter, who you may have heard of, a very prolific historian of medicine, and a very interesting team of people who kind of rewrote the history of medicine, which up until that point had been mostly, retired doctors, writing the story of their careers and the wonderful drugs they'd discovered.
Right.
Roy and Michael Neve and Bill Bynum, all the people who were working out of the Wellcome there, they had come out of the New Left tradition of history from below. And so they looked at medicine not from the point of view of the doctors, but more from the patients. They were very interested in patient testimonies, in the doctor-patient relationship, in how the rest of the culture saw the medical profession.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating to me. And I started doing a bit of work with them there. And that led to a couple of anthologies that I edited for Penguin Classics.
So that's your first book. It's an anthology. You're like, you're editing more, or you're collecting it's more of a collection that was your first entry in.
That's right. Yeah. So the first one was a collection of texts around 1900 and the fin de siècle, which I co-edited with Michael Neve, who was one of the Wellcome academics. And while I was doing that, I talked the editor at Penguin into doing another one, which is an anthology of drug literature called Artificial Paradises.
Why were you interested in medicine? Why were you interested in medicine? I didn't see that coming.
No, I didn't see that coming. It certainly didn't come out of philosophy. I think almost everything that I've been interested in writing about is stuff that was in the interstices, in the gaps of my, formal education.
Yeah.
And so I'd got kind of from early on, drugs was one of the things that I was writing about, because this was the early mid 90s. I was an early.
So it was the drug. It wasn't just. I guess like when you say medicine, you are kind of talking a lot about drugs, but like I guess it wasn't that you were interested in like health conditions. You're interested in medicine. You're interested in drugs.
I'm interested. Yeah, I guess I was interested in what would now be called the medical humanities. I'm interested in the way that our understandings of health and science and the body kind of ripple out through our culture. And drugs struck me as an interesting topic in that at the moment, because it was very much not discussed. I mean, at that time, drugs was the drug problem. So pretty much everything was either about addiction or, criminality.
Right.
But it was fascinating to me that people were going, out every weekend on raves and taking MDMA and doing something that, according to all the medical authorities, was a terrible, dangerous, bad, delinquent thing to do.
Right.
But people were at the same time having enormously positive, life-changing experiences out of this. And I guess I was kind of looking for a language, for a way of talking about that, and using medical history to, give me a framework for that.
That's interesting. So you've got this like personal interest, but something about writing from this historical perspective is giving you yourself an ability to kind of process, navigate some of this, your own interest in these things? Is there something to what you're saying? I just want to be curious how you're articulating that.
No, I think that's right. And I think, I mean, first of all, it was something that I could sell as journalism, because it's a perennially sexy subject.
Right.
And that's why I've returned to it a lot. I thought kind of about 15 years ago, I was done with it. I'd written 2 or 3 books about the history of drugs, and I was at that point on to other things. And I still do write a lot of other things on other subjects. But, it's a subject that there was always kind of demand for. It's a bit edgy and nobody writes about it very confidently. And one of the questions that, I started.
And what drugs are you writing about? What are you writing about? You're not writing about penicillin. You're writing about.
Yeah, I'm writing about unpacking that sort of corpus of what we call, illicit drugs or recreational drugs. I mean, I have written about medicinal drugs in lots of other contexts, but this particularly interested me because it seemed to be at an interface of a kind of philosophy of mind. There was a lot to learn about the mind and the way it works. And there was also a lot to learn about our culture, which is very bifurcated at this moment. This experience, the drug culture was kind of mainstream at this point, but it was treated in mainstream media and culture as if it was something kind of a small, dirty, delinquent corner, until you went on the internet. And then, that was one of the very first things that colonized the internet, were all those alt news groups and bulletin boards and people discussing everything. So that was a kind of fertile, position to be in, to be able to relay that into the wider culture. And then the question that always came up was like, well, where did these things come from? Where did cannabis come from? Where did cocaine come from? And that was what led me, with some support from the Wellcome Institute and a great library on the history of medicine there. But that turned out to be just a treasure trove of untold stories, because they all these substances that we'd kind of lumped together in this category of drugs are all very different. They all come from different places. They all emerge from different contexts. Some from 18th century chemistry, some from, other non-Western cultures. Their story plays out through kind of pharmacology and psychiatry and the mind sciences, and full of interesting insights into how we've ended up where we have today. So that turned out to be very early on to be a sort of fertile seam that kind of launched me as a writer.
What's the first hook? What's the first draw? Like, how are you going about it? I guess, what is your first book, the full non-anthology historical story of drugs, and what class are you focused on initially?
Right. Well, I wrote a book early on called Emperors of Dreams, which was about drugs in the 19th century, because that's what seemed to be where all these stories started. And it was, at the beginning of the 19th century, in Western culture, there's alcohol and there's opium, and that's about it.
Right.
By the end of the 19th century, you're walking into pharmacies and you can order up cocaine or morphine or cannabis or, opium, or sort of, and you've got, people have discovered anesthetics and are experimenting with nitrous oxide and ether. And, so it's an enormous range. It's a big pharmacopoeia that gets assembled in the course of the 19th century. So I did my best to tell that story.
Well, so when you think about, drugs today, and you said it at the beginning, when you say illicit drugs, it's like, I just have this like inescapable mindset about drugs that, is just a product of being born in 1975 in the United States. So, there's just this profound stigma, and it's illegal and dangerous and all these things. But what would have been, like, as this transition is happening in the 19th century, what would the typical, English person, young person, adult, what would their mindset have been about these new things? They would probably so interesting and very, pleasant kinds of experiences. What was the broader kind of cultural mindset and about this stuff? And how often were people using drugs?
Right. I mean, I'm looking at my forthcoming book, which is coming out next year, is kind of is focused on this, but particularly on 19th century science. I mean, the word drugs, as we use it today, this word that you grew up with all these pejorative associations baked into it, that word doesn't even exist until 1900. Until that point, drugs means just all medications,
right?
In the same way that we still use it in like drugstore or whatever.
Right.
So the idea that there is this category of drugs which are kind of bad, and they have that they're kind of foreign and criminal and dangerous, that hasn't really coalesced until the 20th century. And I think because, as you say, that became so ingrained in our consciousness in the 20th century, we kind of assumed it had always been thus. But in fact, if you go back before 1900, you enter a different world. It's scientists, going all the way back to the beginnings of the scientific revolution, if they're studying drugs that alter the mind, the vast majority of them do that on the obvious way, down route one. They take them themselves and write about their experiences. So, and that informs, of course, the popular perception. If you think of very, very popular fictions like Jekyll and Hyde or Sherlock Holmes, this self-experimenting scientist becomes a fascinating character. And of course, in the fiction, it always goes wrong. It's like a Michael Crichton novel. Westworld is not a story if all the robots work okay. You have to have a terrible glitch or a malfunction before you get to Act 3.
I interviewed I interviewed this psychiatrist that you've probably heard of, Rick Strassman.
Yes, I know Rick.
I was talking to him about that because in the history of psychedelics, the self-experimenting science is just like, as much of the story as it's like you have Timothy Leary, but you have just like overwhelming. And he said something interesting. He said the self-experimenting doctor, it is just like the typical story. It's like a very common story, not just about psychedelics, but just they would go that this idea that the doctor would go first is kind of a whole thing. And it's rooted, he said, in the principles of do no harm.
Yep, it is. So there's a whole thing going back particularly into medical science, that you don't experiment on the sick patients. That's unethical. So who do you experiment on? And then there's also the question in the 19th century of what kind of data is this? If I take a drug and have an experience, I can't hold that experience up to other people and say, see for yourself, because it's something that happened in my own mind. So I need to find a language for talking about this. So, and this whole, I mean, Isaac Newton, for example, very early on he famously and gruesomely sticks a bodkin, a needle, in his eye and moves it around and describes, the strange after effects and colors and images that he sees. Wow. And he draws a diagram of this with everybody, with every point labeled A, B, C, D, E as to how you do this. So in other words, this is not data like the data that he's getting out of prisms and studying light, but it is data. And if you want to follow it, you have to do it yourself. That's the that was the Royal Society motto: don't take anybody's word for it, do it yourself. So there's that tradition, which what as Rick Strassman was talking about. And then there's another tradition which emerges in the 19th century, which is about objectivity. Everything should be as data-based as possible, and we should exclude anything subjective or sort of personal to the experimenter. And particularly in psychology, when you get the first laboratory psychologists, so they're studying how long it takes between shining a light in your eye and it blinking, they're unpicking all these, mental processes like perception and sensation. And this is a tradition that isn't really working with drugs because it's working with brass instruments. It's trying to get measurements for everything.
Yeah.
So there's a fascinating dialogue between those two, and self-experiment kind of disappears from a lot of regular medications where you can tell what they're doing by measuring blood pressure or sort of physical external measurements, but it hangs on in these psychoactive or mind-altering drugs because the data that you're studying is not susceptible to objective measurement.
Right. I guess this also kind of speaks to, from what I understand, about the limitation of the animal studies.
Yeah,
about any of these mind altering, because there's just no way to extract that information about what they're experiencing.
Yes, that's right. And animals, I mean, I think sort of one of the early formative figures in this story is Humphrey Davy, the British chemist who discovered nitrous oxide. And he tried that on rats and rabbits and animals, but of course they can't tell you if they're hallucinating or not. They can't tell you what's going on in their heads. So fortunately for him, he had people like Robert Southey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his circle who could inhale nitrous oxide and then give a description of their experience. Which is what Davy called a language of feeling. That was what he was looking for. He found that people are very bad at describing these kind of internal states.
Right.
And the classic doctor question is, how do you feel?
Right.
And people were kind of, so he got a coterie of very sort of progressive, creative, quite competitive people together to try and give their descriptions of what this was like. And this idea of a language of feeling dovetailed very well with the young romantic poets he was working with, because they were also looking for a language of feeling. They wanted a way to talk about mental states and moods that had never been described before. So from that point on, then the self-experimentation has a literary dimension. And a lot of doctors are literary figures. A lot of them write poetry and novels. And this was something that Oliver Sacks, I think, used to write about very well. This is really his golden age, when you didn't have a pill or a DSM tick box diagnosis, you had to learn how to describe your patients and what they were experiencing in very fine detail. So it's a wonderful, rich literature, I think, that medical literature from the 19th century.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I was curious. It seems like from your resume, you've written so many books about psychedelics. Is that accurate? Am I reading it correctly? I know of only one, but did it look like there were several others? Is that wrong?
I've written about psychedelics in lots of different capacities. In the sort of history of drugs, the word psychedelic is interesting. It was obviously coined, by Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in the 1950s. It's a hard word to apply when you go back into history before that point or into non-Western cultures. So a lot of the history that I've been writing about is around hashish or cannabis, for example, or about ether and chloroform and those kind of inhalants and anesthetics. And to me, that is a psychedelic literature because it's concerned with the limits of consciousness and out-of-body experience and the relation between imagination and dream and reality. But it's not strictly psychedelic. There's no LSD back in the day. There's no MDMA. There is the one compound we may get on to talk about more, which is mescaline. But I think in many ways, what we now put under the rubric of psychedelics, that kind of exploring the mind with drugs, did exist previously, and I've written about it quite a lot, but it's not really what you call a psychedelic history because there is no notion of psychedelics at that point.
So this book that you wrote, I have it here, mescaline, a global history of the first psychedelic with Yale University Press, 2018, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. For 2019, I think.
2019?
I think.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that. Yeah.
Wonderful book. Absolutely Fascinating book. What was the origins of that book?
Well, this was one of the stories that I'd had on the back burner for a long time and had written a little bit about, but always meant to do a much deeper dive. Was the story of how peyote, which was a cactus that contains mescaline, that's native to the north of Mexico and a little bit of the south of Texas, and was known since time immemorial to Native American peoples. That was discovered by Western science in the 1890s. So it very, very rapidly, and a very, very few short years between 1893 and 1897, this cactus was brought back to Washington by an anthropologist, an ethnographer working with the Smithsonian, who then gave it to the medical and scientific departments of the university there. So that was the first ever clinical trials of psychedelics. He passed samples of it on to the most famous doctors of the day, people like Weir Mitchell, who's America's leading neurologist, and to William James, the philosopher. And at the same time, Western chemists were busying away, and within a very short period of time had isolated the compounds that produced these, what we would now call psychedelic effects, and called it mescaline.
Yeah.
So I'd always thought that was a really fascinating story of a kind of meeting of two worlds and two traditions, and to see what happens to this this cactus as it's passed from the non-Western indigenous to the Western world, as it passes from being a plant to being a chemical.
Yeah. So given that 1800s context that you were mentioning, where there was just so much discovery of what, for lack of a better word, mind altering or consciousness type things, what was the reaction to this cactus, by these people that were familiar with these other compounds at the time, cannabis even? What did they think when they're presented with this cactus?
Well, it's fascinating because, of course, it's very, very different from the indigenous understanding. It's right from the very beginning. What you get, that kind of classic Western kind of drilling down. So first of all, in the chemical terms, okay, what's in this cactus? What's doing this? Why is it producing these visual hallucinations? And that was what really fascinated everybody, was what we could now call the visuals. Something that indigenous people are not particularly interested in, by the way.
So context here, the indigenous community, how many distinct indigenous communities were aware of and like incorporating in their ceremonial life, if that's even true, peyote?
Well, it had been used for a very long time in Mexico, particularly in northern Mexico, and we know from the very first written reports from the Spanish conquistadors that they found people using it there. The Mexican Inquisition prohibited it, so the people who used it tended to hide out in the kind of canyon country in the north, and the people who really preserved their indigenous rights, who, to this day are a Mexican tribal people called the Huichol.
Why are they prohibiting it if they're allowing alcohol or other what is it that's sort of alarming? They must be observing something.
Yeah, I think what they're observing is what they call the visions. They they observe people using peyote and under its influence prophesying the future, diagnosing illnesses, searching for lost objects, attempting to gain influence, all these magical operations.
I see.
So
is that disruptive? Is that disruptive to the social order at that time? That the government would have thought that?
Well, definitely. In fact, these are Spanish conquistadors coming from Europe in the grips of the witch craze. So where are all these visions coming from? And if they're not coming from the Christian God, they're coming from the devil.
Got it. Oh, so there's a lot of religion sort of in that period. It's not public health, and not even like so much as like the maintenance of society. There's a lot of like religious concern.
Yeah, this is a barrier to the savages becoming civilized and Christian.
So they're even banning it. They're even banning it not in England or Spain, but in the indigenous areas that they're beginning to occupy. They're starting to ban it right there.
That's right. And then they note very early on that how devoted the Indians are to this and how they carry on in secret with their rights with these plants. And but I think they were also, as successive generations, as you started to get to mestizo generations of people who are half Spanish and half Indian, peyote was used by those people as well for kind of sorcery and magic. And generally it was a source of kind of illumination and, it was outside the ambit of the church.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why it was prohibited, because it was the work of the devil and was leading people to the devil.
Well, so what about early 1900s? What's going on there with this Mexican indigenous community of native? And it's predominantly what we would consider to be like native. Do you remember the name of what's the name of the tribes that would have been used?
That was the people who were who still have it at the center of their culture, the Huichol. But then there was a kind of center of diffusion, which was around what's now the border between Mexico and Texas, where it grows, around Laredo and in that area. And there were various tribes who'd been there, particularly Apache groups, the Pan, Mescalero. And but what happened at that point was which brought it into the sort of ambit of the Plains tribes was the forced captivity on the reservations at the end of the Indian Wars, when the Indians were all then penned up in reservations. And at the same time as that, the arrival of the railroad that ran from Mexico up into Texas and up to Oklahoma. Yeah. So diffusing probably around out of southwest Oklahoma, out of the big reservation and the Ouachita Mountains, which was where the Comanches and the Kiowa and the Apache were administered out of. That seems to be the place where the peyote use really got going in the 1880s. But that was something that hadn't, some tribes had known about it as a medicine prior to that, but it was it just
won't grow up in Oklahoma, or it's not native up there.
No, that's right. It's not native.
Yeah.
It's
so are they taking it up to Oklahoma? So it sounds like what I interpreted from the book is that it's like the conquering almost, and then the establishment of these trade routes, but it's the railroads in particular that is there's just a movement of the peyote from Mexico to Oklahoma. That's a big part of the story of the Native American experience with peyote, is railroads take it out of Mexico. Is that right?
Yes, that's one big part of it. Another big part, of course, is the in 1890 is the ghost dance movement, the kind of pan-Indian millenarian movements that was suppressed with the massacre of Wounded Knee, which was really kind of the end of Indian culture, or certainly in the eyes of the federal government, who were pursuing a policy of assimilation. So there was no such thing, as far as they were concerned, as Indian culture. All these people, their kids were being sent off to boarding schools. They were all going to be just like regular Americans. So
what's the ghost dance movement?
The ghost dance movement was, a millenarian movement that emerged kind of on the reservations among the people in forced captivity. It emerged out of a prophecy which said that here are new dances, here are new songs, we're going to get together and do these dances and do these songs, and this is kind of an act of magic that will wipe the white people and their culture away from our lands and will return us to our
I
pristine
see.
past before
I
there were
see.
white people.
Yeah.
So for various people,
Who's doing these? Is this up in Oklahoma?
Yeah, this is happening in Oklahoma, and its center of gravity is in the northern plains, among the Lakota people. So Sitting Bull and so on, where the Wounded Knee massacre took place.
Yeah.
But yes, it's also happening in Oklahoma, and some tribes are sitting it out. Notably, a big, huge figure in this story, Quanah Parker, the chief of the Comanches, at that point, who had had previous experiences with millenarian prophets, and his view was, look, okay, we've got these 160 acres of southwest Oklahoma each. We've got to make this work. This is good pasture land. There are cattlemen who'll pay good money for this. We can get ourselves settled. We can get ourselves established. I'm not going to throw all this away. Just felt like a whole bunch of kind of sort of all day, all night dances that are going to end up being, brutally suppressed by an American military.
Yeah.
So
this was a dangerous. So the ghost dance is actually has some risk.
Very much so, yeah. And it was, as I say, very, very brutally suppressed.
I see.
It was kind of, and it led to, the breakup of all kind of tribal troops and groups, and a sort of wipeout of indigenous culture. Yeah. So peyote, which was then available, was started to be used. We don't quite know exactly where and when, but what emerged was a form of a peyote ceremony which took place in a teepee. The reason it took place in a teepee was because all singing and dancing was banned after the ghost dance. Like the sun dance was banned. There were Protestant missionaries on the reservations. That was the official form of worship for the Indians in forced captivity. So it was in that context that this emerged. It was a group of usually male warriors, people who'd grown up as warriors, expected to live in a warrior culture, now trying to adjust to forced captivity where their culture was being stamped out.
Yeah.
And it emerged that if you could hide out on your reservation in a teepee, in a group of people around a fire, and you could take the peyote, you could kind of recreate the magic of the old days, of your lost culture, and keep it going. And it became, a kind of incubator and a hearth for keeping Native American culture alive.
Are they growing peyote now in Oklahoma at that, or are they shipping it from Mexico? Is it commercial
at that point, or now?
Yeah, at that point.
At
like,
that
for
point,
this practice.
No, at that point it's being shipped. There are, right on the border there around Laredo, there were, and there still are to this day, a handful of sort of Mexican mestizo families known as peyoteros, who have traditionally had the peyote trade there, and people used to go down and buy peyote for them, and once the railroad was there, people would go down and buy it. And still at that time, people were going down with suitcases and filling them with peyote and traveling back to the reservations.
So is that the only market for peyote at that time? There's not really another, like non-Native American, use at that time?
No, peyote is not really understood at that time. There are botanical illustrations of it, but no real sense of its properties or qualities. So just around that time, you're starting to get, there's a woman who's one of the first kind of commercial cactus traders who lives around there, and Anna Nichols in Laredo, and she notices that curanderos, traditional doctors are using peyote for all kinds of things. They're making poultices out of it. They're making, medicines out of it, and they're also kind of drinking it ceremonially for visions.
Yeah.
And so, she writes a letter to Park Davis at that point going, you might be interested in this. So the Western interest in peyote as a as a medicine, it's only starts after, following up on the Indian use.
So they're not interested. Americans and American scientists, they're not really at this time as intrigued maybe by the spirituality of it. They actually think it might have medicinal use.
Yeah, the great proselytizer for peyote at that point is this ethnographer with the Smithsonian Institution called James Mooney, who's a great lover of Indian culture, speaks lots of Indian languages, really knows more about their cultures than anybody else. Most of the other anthropologists or ethnographers are not very interested in peyote because it's something modern. It feels kind of decadent. It's a bit like, there's all this abuse of strong spirits and alcohol on the reservations. They sort of see peyote in that context.
It's just on that continuum, right?
On that continuum of being like a kind of, a sort of rather sad, degenerate habit.
Right.
Mooney sees the value that it has for preserving Indian culture. And
why is that? Why would it preserve Indian culture? What exactly is it? What exactly makes it so sticky for that function?
It's one of the things it builds on, in the ghost dance was pan-tribal. People came together from different tribes for it and built up lots of tribal links. So the peyote religion, or the peyote meeting, when it emerges, keeps those tribal links going, and it builds up a sense of who we are as people, all our shared traditions. So all things like the cedar incense, the eagle feathers, the rattles and the drums, it puts these all into a new context that all the tribes can share with one another. And also it's something that's persecuted, by the white man and by the Western culture. And it's always been felt, but back in its early Mexican days, it was always felt to have power against the white man and against this dominant culture. And so it becomes a kind of and then the state of consciousness it produces is one in which the peyote in the indigenous belief is a person, a non-human person, but a person who in that context speaks to you, gives you the message, tells you what you need to hear. And this may be medical in the sense that it's telling you, you should get your heart checked out, or you should stop drinking alcohol. That's a very common message that's spread through these meetings. But it might also be all kinds of insights, about family dynamics or friends or other people. And it brings everybody together to experience these things together. So it immerses people, in a really kind of deep version of their own culture, right at a point where everywhere else that culture is being emasculated and broken up.
Yeah. So it's interesting that the Christian church, or at least that particular Spanish period, had so much opposition to it. But there's this character in your book, Frederick Madison Smith, who's a grandson of the founder of the Mormon religion. He's a psychologist at Harvard trained, and he becomes a really important figure in actually granting almost like permanence of psychedelics in the United States by creating these constitutional protections for the Native Americans. I was wondering if you could just tell me a little. That's such an unusual, untold story, it seems like.
It's such an unusual, untold story. It's so fascinating. Frederick Smith, as you say, the grandson of Joseph Smith, he'd set up his own kind of breakaway version of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And he was a kind of a progressive figure, as you say. He studied psychology, and he was very much of that progressive era and believing that modern society was becoming industrialized and dehumanized, and what people needed was ecstatic experience and a world to be re-enchanted. And of course, it's always been very important to the Mormons, the outreach to the tribes in Utah and that area.
Yeah.
So Frederick Smith, in the course of that, had heard about the peyote meeting. He'd been invited to join different Indian tribes in the peyote meetings. And he came out of those feeling, this is what we need. We need people not just to come into church and sing hymns, we need people to have a proper transcendent religious experience.
Right.
So, and he became involved with a small group of people. James Mooney was another one. And specifically in Oklahoma, an attorney called Carl Cunningham, who defended Indians against persecution from peyote quite a lot. And in 1918, there had always been attempts to ban, and there were lots of local bans on peyote, state ones, reservation ones, and so on. There was a big push in 1918. The House of Representatives moved for a federal ban on peyote to all Native Americans, so the banning of its sale on reservations and everywhere. And that galvanized a movement in which Frederick Smith and James Mooney and Carl Cunningham and other people pitched in, and they managed just to swing the representative from Oklahoma so that it failed its passage by one vote. But then they sat down. But then they sat down and said, well, look, this is going to carry on. The forces of prohibition, are going to come for peyote. So we need to have what Carl Cunningham called an umbrella of protection. We need to protect ourselves from this somehow. So the idea that emerged was, let's form a Native American church with peyote as its sacrament. We incorporate it in the state of Oklahoma, and then we're protected under the First Amendment.
Now, was the Native American practice with peyote? So this is what I did not know until I read your book. So much I don't know. This Native American church is an amalgam of indigenous spirituality and Christian church, right? The Christian religion, or is that was that marketing that was kind of done to make it palatable, or was there actually some sort of fusion that had happened?
It's really fascinating, and everybody you talk to in the Native American church will give you a slightly different story. And in a way, that's partly the point of it, because quite a lot of Native American groups had converted to Christianity by this point. Other ones hadn't. So it's kind of deliberately left open so that people who believe in the Christian God can pray beside people who believe in the Great Spirit. It's there's also a level, of what jurists have since called, subsequent attempts have called kind of contrivance. It was definitely a bunch of people from different tribes getting together and saying, let's call this a religion and let's call it a church, because that will give us protection against, the prohibition of drugs and the banning of peyote that's coming. So in that sense, it's partly a strategy, but it also reflects the reality of a very diverse Native American world. It's incidentally, as far as I can tell, and this was news to me until I was told this on my travels in Oklahoma, that this is the first time the word Native American was used, was in the Native American church. Because Native Americans were not Americans. They were not granted citizenship until 1925. The Roosevelt's Indian New Deal in the 30s kind of instituted a lot of these kind of protections for religion and culture. But back in 1918, there was nothing like that. So the concept of Native American was new, and the concept of Native American church was really striking.
So they're successful. They get some sort of constitutional protections. Is that right? This is part of just sort of the Frederick Smith and Mooney and others.
Yeah.
But what exactly do they accomplish?
Well, once the church is incorporated in Oklahoma, then I think it's automatically incorporated in every other state, except for the states where peyote is already illegal, which is Utah and Colorado and Arizona, I think, at that point. They set up a church which then spreads out of Oklahoma. Soon there are chapters right across the southwest and going up into the northern plains. They're still heavily persecuted. The leaders of the movement are still locked up. Peyote is still intercepted between reservations. So that battle is won, but the war continues. And yeah, by the 1950s, there are chapters of the Native American Church right over the American states and Canada. It has to change its name to the Native American Church of North America so that it can include the First Nations of Canada and their chapters.
But what I meant was Frederick Madison Smith and others are explicitly saying they're going to allow the United States government is going to have to actually allow for the Native American Church to ceremonially, legally have peyote in its practice, right? That required some sort of, what did that require?
That required the incorporation of the church as a legal entity protected under the First Amendment with peyote as its sacrament. So then you have kind of official religious use.
Right.
So essentially, James Mooney is very well documented because he's always in Washington on committees and hearings. There are always calls to ban peyote from religious leaders, Christian groups, from the sort of Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he's often the only person standing up there and arguing its case. And it's interesting that his case is kind of two-pronged, really. One is, this is a very valuable medicine. It should be part of the Western pharmacopoeia. We should be researching this. We have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
And that's the contradiction to the other side, which is saying this isn't a religion. This is just a kind of drunken orgy, and this peyote is toxic and causes degenerative illnesses. Right. So he's arguing for it on medicinal grounds, but he's also arguing it on religious grounds, saying, this is, these people who have formed the Native American Church are the pillars of the community. Where these people are strong and active, people are giving up alcohol, they're becoming productive. This is the new young generation. They're not warriors, but what they are is, community leaders and teachers. They're becoming literate and civilized. This is what we want, people. Right. We should be encouraging this.
Yeah. I could talk with you all day. This is your book is so fascinating, and we've just barely scraped the surface of it. And everything that you've worked on is just sounds so interesting. And I'm right? You have a new book coming out next year?
I do.
What is the name of that? What is that?
That is called Psychonauts, Drugs and the Making of the Modern Mind.
Oh, interesting.
And that is really the story of how, if you rewind before the 20th century, drug experiments and drug experiences are a huge part of science and medicine and philosophy and culture. And so that era that we think of as the birth of the modern mind, so the beginning of psychology, the birth of the unconscious, the arrival of modernism, that was full of drug experiences that we have kind of edited out. So what I'm trying to do is to restore that story.
That's what is it gonna, where are you gonna stop in that story? What year?
Most of the book is about that pre-1900 period, but the final section of the book, I kind of look at two periods. One, the period around 1900, where the word drugs, as we now know it, was coined, and what that was about, what that shift represented, because it was a much broader closing down of interest in introspection or mystical experience. It was the period of the rise of behaviorism and so on. And then the final chapter is looking at the years are at the late 1950s and early 1960s, which is the backlash against that. That's the period when all this re-emerges, when people get interested in mystical experience again, and people like William James again, and when a younger post-war generation discovers what their parents called, quote, drugs,
Right.
actually produce extraordinary and valuable and positive experiences. And so that kind of presents what we think of as the psychedelic movement, the emergence of the psychedelic movement, not as something that came out of nowhere, but as a recovery of a much longer and older tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. I cannot wait till it comes out. Well, thank you, Mike. It has been just a real pleasure to hear you just your storytelling of all of this. It's just been absolutely fascinating, and strongly encourage the listener to definitely at least check out Mescaline: A Global History of the First Psychedelic at Yale University Press. It's just phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Oh, real pleasure, Scott. Thank you.